And so they were all put in Crystal City, Texas, which was the Department of Justice internment camp. And from there, some 800 were used for that hostage exchange program. And so they went to Japan. Many of them didn't know anything about Japan, had never been in Japan, yet they were used as for this hostage exchange program. So that's part one of the story. So after the war, what happened to these Japanese Latin Americans? Okay, they were stateless people. I mean, Japanese Americans, they were given $25, $50, and told, okay, try to resettle somewhere. Japanese Latin Americans had it even worse in a way, in that their Latin American country said, well, we don't want you back. So a lot of them would say, okay, we're not U.S. citizens, what are we going to do? Some went to this company called Seabrook Farms in New Jersey, which brought in a lot of Japanese Americans and Japanese Latin Americans to work at that company right after the war. But many were forced to go to Japan because they weren't welcome here, they weren't welcome in their home Latin America, so they had to go war-devastated Japan. And so I hear stories of some of these Japanese Latin Americans who had to go. Some went to Hiroshima, where, you know, after the bombing, they saw this devastation, and it's like, what's happening to our lives? You know, we're been interned here, now we're in Hiroshima. So a lot of them had to, you know, try to do what they could in Japan, Seabrook Farms, and try. Some were able to get their citizenship through the help of Wayne Collins, who was an ACLU attorney in Northern California. And he did a great amount for Japanese Latin Americans, and also for many who renounced their citizenship during World War II as well. But I won't get into that story right now. But, so, a lot of these Japanese Latin Americans had to fend for themselves, try to do what they could to rebuild their lives. And so I can't talk about all the intervening years up to 1988, but during the redress movement, you know, where those of us who were involved, you know, we fought hard for the redress movement, and it culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And it was a great victory. It was, you know, it was a relatively small community winning allies from various other communities and winning passage of H.R. 442, which became the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave a presidential apology and monetary compensation of $20,000 to those former internees who were still living at the signing date of the bill, which was August 10th, 1988, almost 20 years ago. But what happened was it wasn't until 1990, 2 years after, we had to fight for appropriations for the Civil Liberties Act. But it was in 1990 when the redress payment checks and apologies first came. And then some of us started hearing about the story of Japanese Latin Americans. And when Japanese Latin Americans rightfully applied for the redress, they were told they were not eligible. And they wondered, why weren't they eligible for the redress? And there was a stipulation, a provision in the Civil Liberties Act that said that you had to have been a U.S. citizen or permanent resident alien during the time of the war. And so Japanese Latin Americans who'd been kidnapped, made stateless people, brought in illegally, were not citizens or the permanent resident aliens during the period. So they were told, you're not eligible. And so those of us in NCR and other people were very concerned, and in 1996, we formed the Campaign for Justice for Japanese Latin Americans. We filed a lawsuit called Mochizuki versus United States, in which we said, you know, it was an outrage that Japanese Latin Americans weren't accorded redress. So in 1998, we were able to negotiate with the Department of Justice. And so there was this, what was going on, this was the closing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, where almost all the redress funds had been used up. And so at that point, it was the very end of the life of the Civil Liberties Act. And so what had happened was the remaining money within the Civil Liberties Education Fund was used to say, okay, we'll accord redress to Japanese Latin Americans. But in the formula, it turned out that that would amount to $5,000 for each Japanese Latin American. And so it was a bittersweet victory for Japanese Latin Americans, because a lot of the plaintiffs were really torn, because they said, if it were themselves, they said they would have refused the compromise. But part of the compromise was that the people who were forced to go to Japan were also accorded that same redress. So in a sense, they felt, okay, for those people, they were willing to go with a compromise. So some people accepted the 5,000, many did, many opted out of that. But during the time after 1988 to now, Campaign for Justice has been fighting for equity in redress for Japanese Latin Americans. And so we're still fighting. We've been working with Congressman Javier Becerra from Los Angeles, who's been really great. He initiated this bill in 2001 to kind of cover the unfinished business, to get equity and redress for Japanese Latin Americans, as well as getting redress for Japanese Americans who were denied redress because of technicalities within the Civil Liberties Act. But we haven't been able to gain much momentum with that bill. But there's good news now, and I wanted to let you know that in your packet, there's a support letter that we hope that you will all sign. And what it is right now, Senator Daniel Inouye has initiated in the Senate, and Congressman Becerra in the House of Representatives have introduced a bill. It's called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Latin Americans of Japanese Descent. And it's patterned after the 1980 Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which held hearings throughout the United States and was pivotal in paving the way towards getting the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So we're trying to get this bill passed to form this commission to look into what happened to Japanese Latin Americans during World War II. So we're hoping that you will sign that support letter, and if you would give it to me afterward, that would be great, because we want to keep track of who the supporters are. And if you can't get it to me, on the bottom of the support letter, it does say you can please mail it to Campaign for Justice or fax it to us. But please, this is a little-known story, and I'm sure you find it outrageous. And we really, and it's 2006. You know, it's a lot of the Japanese Latin Americans, of course, are very advanced in age. We want to make sure that they see equity and redress. So please, if you would help us out. Thank you very much.